So in the previous lesson, we talked about declaring and initializing variables, and that should be a topic that all of you have covered before. You've seen it in previous languages, whether you've done Visual Basic or C++ or Python or whatever it may be. You have seen variables before. You've used variables before. Now we're going to study a topic that will be new to probably a large portion of you, called objects. If you've taken the Java class before in AP Java, you would focus heavily on objects, but if you haven't reached that point in your career, that's okay. We're going to talk about objects on a basic level and then how they are declared, how they are what's called instantiated in C#, and then how we'll use them as well. So, while objects are a different concept than variables, they are in a way similar to variables because variables store one piece of data and objects actually store in memory multiple pieces of related data. So what I like to think about objects as is I like to think about, okay, if I have a car object, a car would have a color, a car would have a make, a car would have a model, a car would have a year. Those are all characteristics, and when I store them in memory, I want them all grouped together. So objects essentially allow us to create something where we can then store all these related characteristics together in memory. So objects essentially I like to think about as they are grouping multiple variables or their characteristics together as they save information in memory. So there are many different types of objects. You've already seen a boatload of different objects as we've studied Kodu and as we've studied just game design in general. I listed a couple that you'll use commonly in monogame in C# as we move forward throughout the next few units. One of them is called a color object, and in a color object you have to have a red value, a green value, and a blue value. So those three byte values would be stored together in memory. Then you also can have something called a rectangle object, and to create a rectangle you have an X location and a Y location. Then you have a width and a height because every rectangle has a different location as well as a different width and a different height. You'll also have what's called a font object. So a font object essentially has a font family, so that's the type of font that you're using, as well as a size value. And then you can also see that I have a gamepad object, which essentially stores, okay, is button R pressed or not pressed? Is button B pressed or not pressed? Is button X pressed or not pressed? So essentially, it'll store those values all together in memory. So from this slide, what I want you to remember is that objects are essentially grouping similar characteristics together. Objects have characteristics, and those are all stored in one location together in memory. So just like variables, we need to declare an object as well before we are able to use it within our program and then to reference it within our program. So the declaration essentially defines the object, and you give your object a type, which, as I've told you before, objects, there are many different types. With variables, we only had the 6 types. With objects, we have many types because there are many types of objects that we would have characteristics for that we would group together in memory. We can actually create our own objects. So I can't put a list here for you. I can talk about different types of objects we may encounter, but you'll notice that there are lots of different types of objects that we may encounter. Now, one thing I want you to notice down below is that the type of the object is generally capitalized. So when we had variables, int, byte, char, all of those were lowercase. What you'll notice here is that our object types, so color and sprite batch, are typically capitalized, and you'll see that pretty commonly throughout the object types that we'll be using. So when we declare an object, we have to choose its type, just like we did with a variable, and we have to have an identifier, which is that object's unique name. So what you'll notice here is that I'm creating a color object, and that color object is named background color. That's its identifier. I have a sprite batch object that I am calling sprite1. So you'll notice that this declaration piece almost looks exactly the same as variables. We're just using object types, and those object types are capitalized, and then we're choosing a purposeful name just like we did with variables. So the next thing we need to do is we need to do what's called instantiate an object. And I will talk about why I'm using the word instantiate instead of initialize like I did with variables. So you'll notice that these vocab words look very similar. I'm going to talk about the differences on the next slide. But when we give objects an initial set of values, so its initial set of characteristics, we are doing what's called instantiating an object. So essentially, you're taking your identifier name, which you can see here is background color, and I'm creating a brand new object with all of the characteristics listed in order. So here you can see that instantiation looks a little bit different. First, what you'll notice is that it's not just set equal to one value because objects contain a characteristic list. So what you'll notice is that with every object that you create, you see this word new. So you're creating a new object of a specific type. And you'll notice this type is the same thing that we had in our declaration. So we're creating a color object, and then after that you'll notice that we have a list of characteristics that that object contains. So inside of a color object you have a red intensity that's represented by the 10, a green intensity represented by the 40, and a blue intensity represented by the 100. And it's the same order every time. So red, green, blue. Red, green, blue. So when you instantiate a color object, the parameters or the characteristics that that object needs to have are listed in a specific order. So in this case, it's red, comma, green, comma, blue, representing the intensities of the various colors. But again, one more time, to instantiate an object, you have its name equals new object type color, and then inside of a list of parentheses, the characteristics of that object in a particular order are listed. So while we use the word declaration to initially declare a variable and an object, you'll notice that I used two similar but slightly different vocabulary terms. So I used initialization to set variables equal to a value that it starts at, and I used instantiation to basically create an instance of an object. So, and then that object has all of its characteristics. So I listed here, initialize gives a singular initial value to a variable to start with. So that word initialize is used with variables. It gives a singular initial value, and you're giving it some value to initially start with. So that's what that initialize means. You're giving it an initial value. Now, an object is a little bit bigger. An object has many characteristics linked together, and it has many actions that it can do. We've talked about that many times in game design. So when we basically create an object, we are creating what's called an instance of a class. So we'll talk about classes later on. That object within our program, and then that object will have its own characteristics that can be changed, its own actions that it can do. So it's not just simply one value, it's multiple values as well as multiple actions that it can do. So remember that we are creating an instance of it. We are creating that object. It's more than just one value. It's actually a group of characteristics and actions linked together. So we are creating what's called an instance. And remember that objects will have characteristics. Those are found within the parentheses as you instantiate it. And then those can be changed down the road. And then we also have actions, or what I'm going to call mini methods down the road, that we can use and that object can actually do. So remember, objects have properties and objects have actions they can do. So we instantiate an object and we initialize a variable. Now, just like with a variable, we can do our object declaration and instantiation in the same statement. So you can do a declaration and then you can do an instantiation separately, or you can do them all together as one. So what you'll notice here is that my declaration contains a type, so a type, and an identifier. I can see that there. So I have my type, I have my identifier, I have both pieces of my declaration right here underlined in red. So that piece right there underlined in red is my declaration. My type is a color type object, and my identifier or my unique name is background color. Now my instantiation is, if I follow up here, my identifier name equal to new color object, and then my list of characteristics that I need to create that object. So you see that little overlap there. The red piece is your declaration, and the purpley pink piece is your instantiation. So you're noticing that you have the type and the name, and then you have name equals new type with the parameter list. So as I stated on many previous slides, there are many types of objects, and too many for me to even list. So you are going to notice throughout MonoGame that we have many built-in color objects that we can access and that we can instantiate throughout our game. So the color object is just one of them where we create a color. You'll notice that we'll use what's called a gamepad object when we want to access the state of the gamepad. We can create a keyboard object when we want to access the state of the keyboard. We have font objects, we have vector objects, we have rectangle objects, and we will use all of those. So those are all built into MonoGame to start. So kind of keeping that in mind, we have many built in that we will reference and we will use, and that I will show you what their parameters are and what characteristics that we can access and change and all of that. The second piece is that we can actually design our own objects as well. So we may not get to that a whole lot in this class, but I want you to be aware that you can design your own object, because there are times when a game or a software can't possibly have built into it what you need. So an example that I picked, because we all know my favorite game is Mario Kart, is Mario Kart itself. So characters in Mario Kart needed to be objects that were created by the designers of Mario Kart, because in Mario Kart, characters each have a special item, they have an image, they have a sound, they have a car, they have a partner. So this wasn't an object that was pre-built. They actually had to design it and program their game to contain these objects. And you can do that in computer programming as well. So we may not get to this point, but please note that as you get to more challenging classes like the AP Java class, you will actually start creating your own classes that end up being outlines for objects. So you can design objects of your own design. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to practice writing a declaration and instantiation, and then a declaration and instantiation together. So if you've declared and instantiated objects before, you can pause the video here and try these 3 examples just to make sure you've got it down. If you're nervous about declaring and instantiating them for the first time alone, please note I'm going to walk through an example in the next few seconds so you can keep watching the video. So again, if you've got it down, pause the video, do these 3. And if you are struggling a little bit, then I'm going to walk through them. So first, I'm going to start with number 2, because this one looks a little bit different. So I see that I have a bug object named Ladybug. So that right there tells me what my declaration should be. So remember, my declaration is my object type, which is bug, and then my name or my identifier, which in this case is Ladybug. So there's my declaration right there. Now my instantiation requires a little bit more information. So I also need to include my list of characteristics or my parameters. So remember, my instantiation has my identifier name, which is Ladybug, equals new object type, which is bug, and then in parentheses I have my parameters. So here I have red 7 2.0 and true. And then last but not least, I have my declaration and instantiation together. So first I need to have my declaration, so it says bug, and then I have Ladybug, so I have my type and my unique identifier name, then equals new object type, which is bug, followed by my list of parameters, which is red 7 2.0 and true. So From here, hopefully you can get started on number 1 and number 3. I do want to touch on, if you for some reason were to have an object with no parameters, please note that those parentheses would just be parenthesis, open parenthesis, and then a closed parenthesis. So just kind of keep that in mind, but most objects will have a list of characteristics. You don't need to worry about that. But pause the video, try the next 2, and then from here you can go on to the next slide and check your answers. So for each of these, just double check that you got your declaration, your instantiation, and your declaration and instantiation together correctly. I will expect that you know the difference between a declaration and an instantiation and how to do them both separately and together, so make sure that you know those vocabulary words very, very well. This is the end of this video, so if you're good with objects, you can move on to the next task.